I hear a lot of people talk about how they feel like they're easily taken advantage of for the things that they give to others or the kindness that they put out in the world. And they feel like it's not reciprocated from others in the same way in which they move through the world. And something that I want to talk about today is the best way to handle that situation, which is to set internal boundaries within yourself, because that's where the gap really is if you are feeling like someone is taking advantage of you. If you're enjoying this video so far, make sure that you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you can catch us on our next video. Now, that doesn't negate that maybe somebody is taking advantage of you, but what it does mean is it means that you don't have the internal boundaries to protect yourself against giving more than you have inside of yourself to give to others, because we can't pour from an empty cup. We must have our own filled cup before we can give to others. And when we are pouring from an empty cup, that's when we tend to feel the most taken advantage of, and that's where our boundaries are vital to make sure we don't go into burnout or feel like we have to sabotage or lose friendships because the dynamic has evolved into something that's not maintainable. First step in handling this is going to be getting into a space of cognitive awareness. So we want to be able to have self-recognition of when we're feeling exploited by others. Our goal is going to be to identify or label the pattern that we're in. So this is going to be internal within us. Do we typically fall into like a people-pleasing pattern, codependency, fear of abandonment? And when we're doing this, we need to look back on previous relationships, whether they're platonic or not, looking at how we function in work environments, also looking at how our caregivers took care of us, because we all have different ways that we had to survive as children. And a lot of the time when you're somebody who's self-sacrificing, you're typically somebody who is in a people-pleasing, codependency, or fear of abandonment state. I'm somebody who has experienced this. I'm working on this right now. A big reason I wanted to make this video is because it's something that I'm trying to work through. And I've noticed for myself is that I think it's a combination of people pleasing for me, because I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I don't want to abandon other people because I've been abandoned. So it's not that I'm scared they will abandon me, but I understand and empathize with the situation and what it feels like to be abandoned. But then I give and that's not reciprocated, right? Because why would somebody reciprocate if I'm just giving away all my energy? And I get to this point where I start to feel resentful and I have to remove myself from the relationship, because in my opinion, it's always been seen as this, well, you don't respect me. Like, how could you not have the same boundaries as me? But in reality, they're not responding to any boundaries that I'm putting in place, right? So you have to understand where this is coming from, and looking at your previous relationships and really reflecting on them is how you're going to get to that conclusion. And that's how I've gotten to my conclusions. I was able to do this through journaling, talking out loud to myself, identifying distorted beliefs, like, what does this mean? So for my example in particular, I don't want people to feel abandoned, so I'll show up for them when nobody else will. Unfortunately, if you're going to put yourself in that position, that person is always going to come to you in a crisis. They're always going to come to you to offload their baggage, to only have a relationship that's rooted in you taking care of their emotions, which creates a codependent dynamic. And even if you're trying to escape codependency, if you're not codependent, you're going to end up in that dynamic, and that's when you start to resent people. And so I would go from the situation of saying, oh, like, I want to show up for these people, and I'd empathize for them over and over and over again. And then eventually I would just get phone calls of them dumping all of their trauma on me, not wanting to hang out, not even asking me about my day, me telling them something about myself, and them completely ignoring it and going back to talking about whatever they're talking about. I grew so much resentment towards these people because I thought, how could you treat me like this when I'm the only person you feel safe to come to, but you're treating me as if I'm just this tool that you get to use? Well, I created that dynamic by not enforcing boundaries and having a healthy way of showing up for people, but also making sure they knew they couldn't just, rely on me to soothe their emotions, because eventually that's what it became. And a part of that was also identifying, what type of person am I attracting? These people are more codependent. Well, I need to figure out a way to not attract codependent partners, codependent people. So after I became pretty aware, and I'm becoming more aware and recognizing how I end up in these situations, I've sat with myself and I've gotten to this place where I have emotionally validated my resentment. I've emotionally validated what that means. And that means that I want to give myself permission to prioritize myself, because the resentment that I was feeling, for example, comes in and it makes me feel like, well, I can't prioritize myself because obviously they need help, but at what cost? To the point where I was running myself into the ground. I mean, I had one friend that I was there for. She would call me every single day, hours. Talk for hours about the same thing over and over again. At what point is it my responsibility to prioritize myself in that situation, right? I can only be mad at myself for not giving myself permission to prioritize myself. So in doing that, you have to acknowledge the internal emotional signals as valid indicators that you need to implement boundaries, that you feel like those boundaries have been violated. Because sometimes we do put those boundaries in place, but we're guilted into showing up for people when we don't have capacity. Good way to do this is to allow your emotions to guide you towards your unmet needs and values. This is called emotional focus therapy. And one way that you can practice this is by understanding the emotions that you're feeling and reframe these feelings as something that you can use as a tool and not something that you should feel shame about. So for my example in particular, right, I was feeling very taken advantage of. I was feeling frustrated. I was feeling angry. I was feeling, what's the word? Unappreciative. I was feeling unappreciated. I felt like, honestly, I was a tool for people to use. And that created a lot of fear in me because I thought, wow, like this is what people think of me. Like this is the only thing that people want me for. Like that's scary. It's scary to be somebody and someone that feels like the only way people will like you is if you completely give up all of your respect for yourself so they can take advantage of the kindness and love you have. And that's not good. That's abandoning yourself. And you get to this place where you have to be able to shift through these emotions and identify them as that frustration, guilt, and fear, because it's not clear at first. It shows up as resentment and anger, but underneath that resentment and anger are those emotions. Sometimes it's sadness. And when you're reframing the guilt that you have to look at it in a way of saying, it's okay that I feel these things. These are tools that I can use to adjust my actions to ensure we don't end up in this situation again. So we're not labeling these emotions as bad because, unfortunately, when you're somebody who lacks boundaries, it's coming from a place of wanting to give people something that you didn't receive, your own unmet needs. It's almost like a mirror, right? And you can feel guilty about reclaiming your time and your self-respect and prioritizing yourself because you do feel these negative emotions towards people that you care about. But those negative emotions are not something that you should feel bad about because they are just indicators that something needs to adjust. So creating that healthy relationship with emotions is really important in the process of setting those boundaries. So once you've identified these emotions and what's going on internally, that's when we go into defining and differentiating our boundaries and forming those boundaries and making sure that we can create boundaries that are going to meet our time, emotional, physical, and energetical experience to ensure that we are allowing ourselves to pour into ourselves. So the goal is to define the type of boundary that you need. It can be any of those. So it can be rooted in time. It can be rooted in emotional bandwidth, physical, energy, or even material. And that comes down to a place of like money and finances. So by creating this interpersonal effectiveness, by defining your boundaries, it allows you to assert your needs because you are unclear and everyone else is unclear around you, or they wouldn't be behaving in this way. Because a lot of the time, these people love you. They care about you. They don't realize that they're crossing boundaries. Everybody is not as nefarious as most people believe. And it's hard because when you are having your boundaries crossed, you can come to find offense to it. You can feel upset about it. But in reality, everyone is kind of living in their own world today. And so by making your boundaries clear and being effective in relationships and being able to express them in a healthy way, this allows you to define those boundaries that you've internally created with yourself. So once you've identified the type of boundary that you need to be specific with the type of boundary that you put out. So when you're writing down your boundaries, an example of this can be, I can't spend every single day on the phone with people. I can't lend money to anyone. I'm not available on these days or times. I can't text somebody all day because their emotions are uncontrolled. You have to get specific when you're outlining what your boundaries are, because vague boundaries can invite overstepping because you're not being as specific with implementing those boundaries. It's kind of like having rules for how you're going to self-respect yourself. That's the best way that I can put it. Now, once you've defined these boundaries, you have to be able to communicate these boundaries. And I think this one's a little interesting because I am somebody who doesn't like communicating my boundaries because I just act on my boundaries. And that's a part of the issue that I'm trying to work through. Because for me, when I implement boundaries, I find it almost more, I'm more terrified of just ending up in a conflict because I have a need, because I've asserted that dominance before and I've communicated those things and it hasn't worked out well. People were very offended from the fact that I couldn't continue to give to them. And for me, I've learned that the best way is to define those boundaries earlier on in the relationship and just be somebody who moves the way that I move. And if somebody asks me about it, then I can tell them, oh, well, I'm not somebody that texts all the time. If you want to talk to me, let me know. We can meet up and get some coffee. And so I'm defining my boundary in the beginning and I'm setting those expectations. But when I'm in relationships with people and something has gone on a little too long, then I'll communicate the boundary. And I'll say something like, hey, I need some time to myself. I really need to focus on myself. I'm really glad I could be of help, but I'm overwhelmed and I have a lot going on. So, I got to handle some things and I'll reach out when I'm ready. That can be very scary because it's hard to know how people are going to react, but you have to be willing to lose people when you start to respect yourself, because respecting yourself is going to be something that is going to drive away people who are capitalizing off you not having those boundaries. So when you state your needs clearly, don't apologize. You don't even need to defend it. I probably over-explained too much. That's something that I need to work on. But you have to communicate it in a very respectful way. This is a theory which is rooted in nonviolent communication. So this helps people express their needs without blame or aggression by using the structure of observe, feeling, need, request. So an example of this is saying, when I'm expected to drop everything, I feel overwhelmed. I need more respect for my time. Going forward, I won't be able to do that. You have the observation, right? You have the feeling, I'm overwhelmed. You have the need, I need more respect for my time. And then the request. Avoid over-explaining, because that's a sign of guilt, and you need to be okay with prioritizing yourself without feeling guilty for it, because then that's going to produce shame within yourself for prioritizing yourself, and prioritizing yourself is not something you should feel shame about. Keep it clear, concise, and short, and the right people will respect it. And eventually, it will be able to heal the relationship and dynamic so that moving forward, those expectations are in place. Once you communicate these boundaries, you have to reinforce it for it to be respected. So boundary reinforcement through behavioral reinforcement is only going to be real if you uphold it. When this boundary becomes tested, you have to make sure that you follow through with what you said. It doesn't matter if the sky is falling. If you said that you are overwhelmed when something occurs, you can't bend yourself, because then that teaches the person that if it's a big enough issue, you're willing to sacrifice your boundaries. And then anything can be a big enough issue. And it's a slippery slope to lose respect in the dynamic and relationship. And somebody who respects you is going to hear your boundaries and do their best to respect that, but they're also human, so you have to give them grace, right? That's why it's important to uphold the boundaries within yourself, because they are not bad people for having their own tendencies. We're all just people with tendencies. And the best way to protect yourself is to uphold your boundary and teach people how to treat you. The theory that supports this is operant condition in behavioral psychology. And people will learn how to treat you based on what behavior gets reinforced. If someone crosses a line, you let it slide. You're unintentionally training them to keep doing it. And I'm somebody, look, I am a registered behavioral technician. I graduated from UCLA with a psych degree. I'm very well versed in operant conditioning. I let this slide a lot in my life. And it's because while I'm aware of the reinforcement, it's hard. It's hard because you care about people. You love people, especially if you're somebody who was raised in codependent environments and people-pleasing environments where you are abandoned and you have these triggers where you feel like you have to earn love from others. It's hard when people come to you. You want to be there for them because it's a part of you that feels like no one was there for you. But you have to be willing to be that person that's going to be there for you in those situations, because even though you're trying to heal that part of you by being there for others, you're still abandoning yourself and perpetuating the cycle. You have to understand that if you don't reinforce it, you can't be mad at people for taking advantage of the slide that you give them, because that's a natural thing that a human's going to do. They're going to think it's okay because you're showing them that it's okay. If a boundary is tested and if somebody is not responding well to your boundary, right, then you have to set a natural consequence. And this is something that is not easy to implement, but something that you can do, for example, is saying, if you keep calling when I say I'm not available, I'm going to have to stop responding. Let them know the consequences of them not respecting your boundaries. Make sure that you're being consistent and understand that the mixed signals is going to create confusion, and then you're going to feel like they're not respecting your boundaries, but you're the one that's enabled them to feel that way, that they can. You also have to understand the difference between enforcing and punishing, right? You don't want to do it in a way that is to hurt somebody else. And this is all subjective. If you do something to somebody and they're reacting to you and then you use a boundary like that, that's manipulation, okay? We're talking about having healthy boundaries about when you're feeling like you're being taken advantage in situations, not when you are in a situation where there is something going on between you and somebody else and they're asking for clarity and then you pull up a boundary to silence them. So you have to understand the line between that, and that's going to take a lot of reflection, and it's something that you'll have to get accustomed to in the identifying boundary stage. As you're reinforcing these boundaries, the next step internally for you to move past that feeling of resentment, anger, frustration, and guilt, and not get triggered when someone does cross your boundary. And this is something that I'm notoriously really bad at because I have a really unregulated nervous system. I've been working on setting boundaries like my whole life because I wasn't raised with boundaries. So setting boundaries is very hard. And my nervous system regulation, when somebody crosses my boundaries, I can get extremely reactive and extremely triggered. So I've learned that the best way to handle these situations is to not react, but to regulate myself. And I've had to learn how to stay grounded when I'm feeling that discomfort. So regulating that guilt that I can feel sometimes, because sometimes you feel guilty, the anxiety I feel of maybe the friendship ending or somebody not choosing me because I stuck with my boundary on something and I stood firm in my truth, even if that person doesn't agree. I mean, this can be in anything. This can be in any type of belief systems that I have. This can be in who I am as a person, right? Not everybody I know is going to agree with everything about me, but I can't have anxiety over the fact that they're not going to like me just because I have a different outlook or understanding on something that directly impacts me. But the fear that comes up is that trigger that you're having to regulate throughout this process, because the whole reason that you've been struggling to set these boundaries is because your nervous system is avoiding being activated, because we don't want our nervous system activated all the time, right? Nobody wants to be in fight or flight 24/7. I mean, at one point I probably really did enjoy that, but that was because I grew up in that environment. And now that I've been deregulated for so long, I'm like, wow, I'm in fight or flight. Like my smoke alarm will go off and I like jump and I'm like, whoa. Wow, I'm reactive to fear. This is crazy. Like, what an experience. It's so peaceful not living in fight or flight. So we don't want to live in fight or flight 24/7 once we heal that connection with it. We've learned how to regulate our system somewhat. We will get triggered, and those triggers will feel bigger because we're not in fight or flight constantly. Now we're going from a state of being relaxed and feeling safe, and then all of a sudden feeling extremely triggered and as if somebody had just double crossed us because they called us at the wrong time or because they keep texting us over and over again. Have to be able to regulate that and not react, or you're probably going to do something that you will regret. The theory around this is the polyvagal theory. And this theory explains how your nervous system reacts to perceived threats, even emotional ones like rejection. So boundary setting can activate that response. Good way that you can practice regulating your nervous system is using grounding techniques, deep breathing, going on a walk, hand on your chest. I like to sit on the floor. I pet my dog. I remind myself that this isn't real, that this is something that is happening because of my previous relationships, because of things that have occurred in my life. I remind myself that this feels threatening because it's unfamiliar, not because it's wrong, right? Especially because if you have never set boundaries before, if you've never kept your boundaries internally with yourself, it's going to feel really unfamiliar to all of a sudden implement these boundaries. And it's not easy. This is not easy. I lost a lot of friends doing this, and I don't regret it because at the end of the day, my friends knew what I struggled with growing up, and they knew that I had all of these experiences. And so when I started setting those boundaries, finding out that it offended them that I had boundaries made me understand why I was attracted to those people in the first place. And that's because they simply reminded me of the people who caused my inability to set boundaries in childhood. And that's okay, right? But we are attracted to the people that we're familiar with. And now I'm trying to move in the world where I'm creating healthy dynamics and sometimes healing with people who have unhealthy dynamics, but learning how to traverse these delicate situations so that way we can grow together and not necessarily create that same type of dynamic or self-fulfilling prophecy. Because I think in today's world, it's very easy to trauma bond and have these relationships that are very similar to our past. But the best thing that you can do is move forward and take that proactive action and put yourself in this unfamiliar territory. Sit with yourself and talk yourself off the edge and understand that this is something that you will get used to. But the first couple of times, even for years, I've been feeling like it activates this sense of fear and discomfort that I'm not really used to. For going through this, I would advise journaling. Journaling will help you identify whether this is intuition or your nervous system activation, because someone could really care about you and love you, and they could activate this within you on accident. There's other things that you should be looking out for as well when you're journaling. Like, does this person remind me of people from my past in that trauma bond format? Because that can also be the case. And that might signal to you that this person might not be in alignment with you. So make sure that you're documenting how you're feeling as you're going through this regulation process, and continue to track each situation so that way you can make the best decision when you get to the point where you feel like you don't really have any other option but to move forward in a certain way. As you continue to go through this process with your boundaries, this is going to change your identity. This is going to integrate an identity of somebody who doesn't just have boundaries, but somebody who respects themselves, who honors themselves. You're going to start shifting your self-concept to include healthy boundaries as a core part of who you are. Not something that you have to add on and implement and interject and fix, right? But it's going to be just who you are. You're going to move through the world with these boundaries. And you're going to be in situations where your boundaries are just going to be natural for yourself. This is done through the self-concept theory. where we act in alignment with how we see ourselves. So if you see yourself as a giver or easygoing, setting limits does feel unnatural. But our identity is ever evolving and fluid, and boundary setting can become a part of your self-respect nature. So you can be somebody who is easygoing. You can be somebody who is giving and have boundaries. But a lot of the time, people who think like that, myself included, never thought about the boundaries. There's this way that you're kind of trained when you're somebody like this, where you're trained that having boundaries is wrong. Having boundaries is bad because that means that you're not just selflessly giving to others. And that's just not something that is sustainable, and it's not the true definition of somebody who is a giver. Somebody who is a giver is somebody who implements boundaries as they give because they are self-respecting themselves and they're respecting you. Because if somebody is giving outside of their means, you're not really respecting the other person if you're lacking in your boundaries, because you're promising something that you can't deliver, and eventually you're going to have to hurt them when you pull away. So you're changing your theory of yourself, and you're including the parts of being a giver in your self-concept and identity. And this is when you know that you fully integrated this boundary practice, and you're going to be able to go through and affirm the reality in which you deserve to protect your peace. So when you're at the final stage after you regulated your nervous system and now you're going into this identity integration process, you want to use affirmations that are going to change this narrative of not including boundary setting in the current identity that you have. The way to do this is by using phrases like, I'm allowed to protect my peace. I'm allowed to put myself first. I'm allowed to say no to things. I'm allowed to want something even if other people don't understand it. I'm allowed to be myself. I'm allowed to have my opinions, because you are. And it's hard because when you are self-sacrificing that, you've taught yourself that you're not allowed to do those things, but you are allowed to do those things. And so doing this, whether it's in the mirror or through journaling, and following it up with a reflective statement saying something like, who am I becoming by choosing to speak up for myself? And write down who you're becoming. Who would I be without boundaries? Who was I before I implemented boundaries? How did my relationships go before? How did I feel about myself before? And then as you continue to affirm this, your identity is going to be solidified as somebody who loves themselves by setting boundaries for themselves internally, and you will have the right people around you naturally, because a part of this process is not being attached to the outcome when you set these boundaries and knowing that you will lose some people in the process, and that's okay. But you'll begin to surround yourself with people who model healthy boundaries. You'll begin to find people who respect you for your boundaries. And that's where you want to be, because unfortunately, when you lack boundaries, you do attract people just like you who are struggling with the same things, but you're also going to attract people who will take advantage of that. And you want to be around people who have the same self-respect for themselves, and that will be something that you'll be able to identify now that you know how to identify setting boundaries within yourself. Just remember that when you're going through this process, it's not going to be easy. I'm not going to lie to you and be like, oh my gosh, this has been the easiest thing I've ever done. Nothing is easy. Nothing is easy, but it's vital and it's important, and it's something that you have to do, because if not, you're going to end up in a situation where you feel like you can't find anyone, you can't trust anyone, and you can. You just have to be willing to define the type of person that you are when you go out in the world and not sacrifice that for the acceptance of others. Because the way I think about it, do you want to go your whole life pretending to be somebody, sacrificing your entire essence for a little bit of self-approval from others, and look back and think, did people even really like me? Or do you want to be your authentic self, moving through the world with self-respect for yourself, not denying who you are or your truth in healthy ways? And look back and say, while I had issues with some people in the past, I was able to find the people who were directly in alignment for me and meant for me, because I was unwilling to sacrifice who I was to be comfortable for a moment. If you guys like learning about setting boundaries, understanding the depths of your being, Join the Evolution Revolution on Substack. And if you like understanding the truth behind the trends, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We'll see you next time, guys.